What is up, guys? This is Trevor with VC Prep, and today I'm going to be going over the SAT grammar section of the reading writing part of the SAT, or the digital SAT to be more specific. So, first off, I'm just going to tell you guys the key concepts that you need to complete any grammar question on the SAT. And to be honest, you don't need to get too specific into the actual question type of the subsections of grammar, because if you know how clauses work, you're going to be able to get the questions right. Firstly, we're going to go over how there's independent and dependent clauses. Now, an independent clause, also known as a main clause, is a group of words that contains a subject and a predicate, which is just a verb, so you don't have to worry about that, and expresses a complete thought. It can stand alone as a sentence because it gives complete meaning. For example, she went to the store. Now, it's important to note that a clause just means like a part of a sentence, right? I mean, you can obviously split hairs and say that it must contain a subject and a predicate, but just, if you look at a sentence, there's going to be a clause in there. There might be two, there might be three. Clauses are just pieces of a sentence. Now, a dependent clause, also called a subordinate clause, is a group of words that also has a subject and a verb, but it does not express a complete thought, and therefore cannot stand alone as a sentence. And our example here is because she needed to buy groceries. So you can see that our first one, she went to the store, works on its own. Whereas our second one, because she needed to buy groceries, just answers a question that the readers might have about the first. She went to the store. You could ask who, what, where, when, why. And all these questions could be asked because of how simple that independent clause is. And a dependent clause is just going to be essential or non-essential identifying information that just answers one of those questions. In our example here, we have the why. Well, she went to the store because she needed to buy groceries. I could have changed this, and this could have been the where. She went to the store on Fifth Street, right? And that would be in a dependent clause. And so here we go. We can see the sentence together. It says she went to the store because she needed to buy groceries. And I have them color coded. So the red is dependent and the green is the independent part. So it makes a lot of, it's very important the way that these clauses are ordered. And our first way that we're going to look at this order is dependent to independent. There's going to be a comma to separate the two. If you create a YouTube channel, you'll need to make a password to log in. Well, I want you guys to notice how you'll need to make a password to log in with a period here. This could stand alone as a sentence. We could cross this orange completely out, and you'll need to make a password to log in would make sense as a sentence. However, it would leave a reader asking a password to what? Well, here's where our dependent clause comes in, adding non-essential context to the sentence. If you create a YouTube channel, this is when you'll need to make a password. Again, when I read an SAT passage, I pay close attention to certain details in the writing. I pay close attention to certain details in the writing period, works alone as a sentence, and therefore it's an independent clause. But people might ask, what writing? And that's when this identifying information, this additional context comes in on the red here. Because I subscribed to VC Prep, I got a 1500 on my SAT. Well, it sounds like something you guys should do. But anyways, I got a 1500 on my SAT, works alone as a sentence, and someone could ask why or how. How did you get a 1500? Well, here's where our dependent clause comes in, and it's because I subscribed to VC Prep. Now, you'll notice in all of these examples, there's a comma separating the two. And this is because anytime you have a dependent clause before an independent clause, there must be a comma. So when you see a question that says, what punctuation would work best, blah, 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 just determine whether or not it's a dependent clause before and whether or not there's an independent or dependent clause afterwards. If it's dependent before, independent afterwards, you need to have a comma separating the two. Now, there's another order of clause that you could do, which is independent to dependent, and if you do this way, you just don't use any punctuation at all. You'll need to make a password to log in if you make a YouTube channel. I pay close attention to certain details in writing when I read an SAT passage. This is what gets a lot of people because when you see those options, you see that there's going to be one option where there's a comma in between these two. And you sound it out in your head and you're like, oh, that kind of sounds right, but it isn't right. If there's an independent clause, if that first clause stands alone by itself as a sentence, then you have no punctuation coming to the dependent clause afterwards. So when you're looking at your options, if you can determine that the part that you're supposed to fill in is a dependent clause, and you read before that and you see that it's an independent clause, you just need to know that there's going to be no punctuation separating the two. Because this would make it so that, if you had punctuation, this could create complications with the independent clause here. Maybe there's a comma here. Adding a comma here would mean that this is non-essential and could be taken out. But we're going to talk about that in a second. So I just want you guys to notice how all three of these examples are exactly the same as the sentences that we have here. However, because their order is reversed, you just don't use a comma. If it's independent dependent, you have no comma. If it's dependent independent, there's a comma separating the two. Now, how do you do independent to independent? Well, there's actually three options. The first of which is you can simply start a new sentence, right? This could be very obvious, but the SAT reading writing section is hard, period. This stands alone as a sentence. You take it as a junior in high school, period. This stands alone as a sentence. However, we can just separate the two with a period because they're both independent clauses and therefore they can just stand alone as a sentence. They make sense together. Or you can do a comma plus fanboys, which is for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. In this example, I used and we can do the SAT reading and writing section is hard, comma, and you take it as a junior in high school. This is still grammatically correct, even though we're separating them with a comma because it's two independent clauses, so we can use comma plus fanboys. Here's the period new sentence, which I accidentally used my example to tell you guys about. And then we also finally have a semicolon. The SAT reading writing section is hard, semicolon, you take it as a junior in high school. I just want you guys to assume that a semicolon, as far as SAT stuff goes, functions just about the same as a period. You're never going to see a question that has a semicolon and a period as the option unless both of those answers are wrong. So if you do see a period and a semicolon as options for questions, therefore neither of those two are right, and you can narrow that down to figure out what the actual right answer is. But a semicolon is going to serve the same function as a period, and it's going to be used to separate independent clauses and such. So now I just want to give you guys another way to look at independent versus dependent clauses is there's essential versus non-essential clauses. Now, essential clauses modify keywords and are important to the main point of a sentence, whereas non-essential clauses provide information that, while interesting, does not change the main point of a sentence, which in other words just means that it's extra identifying context or information that isn't crucial or essential to the sentence. So, for example, we can see here Plato, the Greek, wrote the Republic. Well, calling Plato a Greek is true, and it is interesting, well, depending on how you view that, but it doesn't actually change the meaning of the sentence. We could remove the Greek and we could do Plato wrote the Republic, and it would still serve as a sentence perfectly, right? Now, however, if we just switch the order up a little bit and we had the Greek philosopher, comma, Plato, comma, is one of the founding fathers of metaphysics, this wouldn't make sense. If we treated this blue Plato here as the same as we did this non-essential one, and we made this box orange, and we turned it into non-essential by separating it with two commas, it would mean that because it's not essential, it can be taken out of the sentence completely. And if we did that, it would say the Greek philosopher is one of the founding fathers of metaphysics, which doesn't make any rhetorical sense, it doesn't make any grammatical sense, and therefore cannot be right. So in the instances like this, since it's essential to our sentence, we cannot separate this with any punctuation, no semicolons, no periods, no commas. Now, what you're going to see a lot is actually displayed in this sentence, and it says the Greek philosopher Plato, right? So this Greek philosopher, you're going to see plenty of sentences that have identifying information like this, Greek philosopher, and then it's going to add your extra, your word that goes in, and there's going to be punctuation, and your options are going to be like a comma, semicolon, yada, yada, yada. It's crucial that you don't put punctuation. If there's essential identifying information that comes before your subject, which in this case is Plato, there's not going to be any punctuation separating the two, and this is what's known as a restrictive appositive. A restrictive appositive. So just understand that if you see essential identifying information like the chemical compound, and then it says the name of the chemical compound, there's not going to be any punctuation separating the two. I know that's one of the practice test questions, so just be on the lookout for that. If there's essential identifying information that comes right before your subject, do not separate them with any sort of punctuation at all. So here are the two type of SAT grammar questions that you're going to see and their boundaries. I have some example problems that we're going to solve right now, and let's just get into it. So on April 5th, Kitty Cohn and 150 other disability rights activists entered a San Francisco federal building after pleading for years to no effect for the passage of key anti-discrimination legislation, blank, until their demands were addressed. So this, this doesn't matter, and to be honest, neither does this, because they're two sentences. Since it's grammar, all we need to really focus on is the sentences that affect each other, because in grammar, you're not going to have to notice any details up here, because it wouldn't change anything grammatically about this sentence down here. So I don't know if that makes any sense to you guys, but don't worry about the sentences before and after if it's a grammar question. If it's not a grammar question, you should read those. But since it is a grammar question, all we have to do is actually focus on the actual part in question, which is what I've put little parentheses around. So right now we can see, after pleading for years to no effect for the passage of key anti-discrimination legislation, blank, until their demands were addressed. So we need to figure out who is pleading, which, is clearly going to be these activists that you can see here. And we need to find an answer that mentions the activists. So pressure on lawmakers. See how it starts with pressure? Our first word or first part of this question or this blank must be whoever they is. It must address and have that as their subject. Pressure on lawmakers is not a they, so therefore that is not the wrong answer. A sit-in protest can also not be the right answer because that's not who they is. They're not a sit-in protest. Lawmakers, right, to the passage of key anti-discriminations, lawmakers came under increased pressure when the activists. Well, see, it starts with a subject, but it's the wrong subject. We're not talking about the lawmakers. We're talking about the activists. The activists increased pressure on lawmakers by staging a sit-in protest until their demands were addressed. It's going to be D because it is our subject and it matches. Here's we go. We have a harder one here. So let's just get into this. Despite being cheap, versatile, and easy to produce, blank, they are made. So we have they. That's already going to tell us that there's a subject. There are two problems associated with commercial plastics. And then we have a colon. We have another colon. We have no colon. And we have another colon. So for here, we need to figure out what the subject is. Despite being cheap, versatile, and easy to produce. Well, they're talking about they, and so there are is not cheap, versatile, easy to produce, so it can't be our subject. This one's wrong. Two problems. This one can't be our subject because it doesn't talk about what they is, what is cheap, versatile, and easy to produce. And therefore, it has to be one of these two because these two are both talking about commercial plastics. Now, one of them has a semicolon, one of them doesn't. Colon. One of them has a colon, one of them does not. And what I want you guys to know is that colons are essentially periods, except they're used to start lists. So a colon, and ignore this horrific handwriting, but I want you guys to write this down. Colons are just used to start lists. And in this instance, we have they are made from 1, non-renewable petroleum, and 2, do not biodegrade in landfills. Therefore, our answer must be D because this is a list. Now I'm going to go over a boundaries question, medium, and then I'll do a hard one, and then that'll be it for the video today. But let's see how this goes. A study led by scientist Rebecca Kirby at the University of Wisconsin, so it does not really matter, this part doesn't, found that black bears eat human food before hibernation. Black bears that eat human food before hibernation have increased levels of a rare carbon isotope, comma, and then we have to figure out what this is. Now, remember what I was talking about non-essential versus essential clauses. Now, this carbon-13 is clearly very important because all of this sentence, with these elevated levels, this whatever it is, carbon-13, is clearly essential. We need to know what it is to the passage. So therefore, this cannot have a comma here because it would make it a non-essential clause, and therefore we could just remove it in the sentence would make sense, but that isn't true because we need to know the name of this thing. So we cannot end with a comma, which immediately lets me get rid of two answers. It has to be one of these two. Now, carbon-13, comma 13C due to the higher, this just doesn't make sense, right? It's still, there's a comma here, so there would still be a comma, and this would still be bordered by commas, and therefore it would be, non-essential, and we could remove it with making sense, which would not work. That wouldn't work. So therefore, our answer has to be B because there is no comma. No comma. Well, there's going to be a comma here, I guess, if you look at the blank. But there's comma, no comma, which means that it is a essential clause and it cannot be just removed from the passage because it's not separated from the passage by two commas. All right, and finally we have boundaries hard, and this is going to be the last question of the day. With some 16,000 in attendance, the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts, blank, or Festac 77 as the event was more commonly known, became the largest Pan-African event on record. Festac drew, this doesn't matter at all because it's a grammar question. However, immediately what I'm seeing is one of these, right? Became, right? So because there's a dash here, and that because this is not its own, because this, all right, so what I've underlined here is actually just the continuation of this sentence, because we can infer, watch, with some 16,000 in attendance, the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and blank became the largest Pan-African event on record. So culture, you see the separation is going to be on this side of the word culture every time. So we can actually just fill in, this is going to say culture, and then we just have to figure out what punctuation. So if we read based on that, we can go with some 16,000 in attendance, the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture became the largest Pan-African event on record. Because we can just continue reading, it means that everything in here, right, I'm just going to do this everything in here is non-essential because it can be taken out in a sentence and still make sense. The only way that we can combine, this part with this part and make it non-essential is if we match this little dash here that separates the non-essential part from the essential part. And so therefore our answer is going to be B because if you end with a dash, therefore you needed to start with a dash. So answer is B. And that is going to be it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the grammar video, and I hope that this was helpful to you. If you guys want to put some comments down for more questions you have, I can do another response video to those questions and explain some more grammar stuff. Or if you have questions that are hard, just let me know about those, and I will address them as well.